The first rule of suburban living is that quiet is a lie. It's not peace. It's the absence of honest noise, replaced by a low, simmering hum of passive aggression. It's the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower starting at precisely 7:01 a.m. on a Saturday, a minute after the noise ordinance allows. It's the faint, judgmental whir of a synchronized sprinkler system activating in perfect, soul-crushing unison with every other house on the block. Here, in the sprawling beige paradise of Harmony Meadows, the silence is so loud it could drive a man insane. And I was getting damn close. I traded backstage passes and pyrotechnics for property taxes and the thrill of separating my recycling correctly. For 10 years, I was a touring lighting designer. My job was to make chaos beautiful, to paint the air with color and energy for screaming crowds of 20,000. Now, I worked in corporate IT, my most creative act being the time I changed the server room's password to correct horse battery staple _ I told myself it was called growing up. It felt more like giving up a vital organ in exchange for a slightly better dental plan. I was sitting on my back patio, nursing a lukewarm coffee and admiring the one thing about this house I truly loved. A simple, elegant string of warm, white Edison-style bulbs I'd hung over the flagstones. They weren't bright or obnoxious. They cast a gentle, golden glow, the kind of light that makes you want to pour a glass of bourbon and solve a small, manageable problem. It was my tiny rebellion, a splash of speakeasy warmth in a sea of sterile 5,000 K LED floodlights. It was my peace. Which is why, when I saw her, I knew my peace was about to be officially, bureaucratically, and thoroughly shattered. Her name was Carol Peterson, and she was the undisputed queen of this beige kingdom, the president of the Harmony Meadows Homeowners Association. She was on her daily patrol, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy text. She wore a sun visor the size of a satellite dish, sensible yet authoritative New Balance walking shoes, and a fanny pack that I was certain contained a tape measure, a color swatch book for approved shades of taupe, and a small vial of tears from non-compliant residents. She wasn't walking so much as scanning. Her head swiveled with the methodical precision of a security camera. She paused at the Hendersons' place, making a note. I squinted. From this distance, it looked like she was measuring the height of their prize-winning petunias. Nothing was beneath her notice. Nothing was beyond her jurisdiction. I ducked back inside, hoping the glare on the sliding glass door would render me invisible. It was a fool's hope. Carol had the predatory senses of a hawk that fed exclusively on minor covenant violations. I watched as her gaze swept across my property. It passed over the perfectly edged lawn, the recently pressure-washed driveway, the mildew-free siding. And then it stopped. Her eyes narrowed, locking onto my patio, onto my beautiful, warm, gentle lights. She didn't move for a full 10 seconds. I imagined a tiny, malevolent targeting computer whirring behind her eyes, calculating lumen outputs and color temperatures. Then, with a curt, vicious little nod, she scribbled something on her clipboard. It was a death warrant. I didn't know for what exactly, but I knew it was coming. I finished my coffee, the taste now bitter and metallic. The low hum of the suburbs had just found its voice, and it sounded a lot like the scratching of a ballpoint pen on a violation form. The quiet was about to get very, very loud. The official notice appeared on my front door 2 days later, affixed with a piece of tape so perfectly aligned it was a work of minimalist art in itself. It was a crisp, cream-colored sheet of paper. The Harmony Meadows logo, a sterile graphic of 2 identical trees and a swooping bird, embossed at the top. It radiated an aura of smug, unassailable authority. I pulled it from the door and began to read. It was a masterpiece of the form, a document so steeped in bureaucratic jargon it could have been written by a committee of depressed robots. Violation notice, #867-5309, it declared in a bold, soulless font. Dear resident of 124 Subversion Street. Okay, the street name was actually Summer Oak Lane, but in my head, it was Subversion Street. Please be advised that a routine inspection conducted on October 6, 2025, has revealed a violation of the Harmony Meadows covenants, conditions, and restrictions. My eyes scanned down, looking for the meat of the accusation, and there it was. A paragraph of such exquisite pettiness it almost deserved to be framed. Violation of Harmony Meadows, Covenant 7.4b, unapproved luminescent fixtures. Said fixtures, located on the rear patio of the property, exhibit a Kelvin temperature below the board-approved 3000 K minimum for ambient exterior lighting. Furthermore, the fixtures exceed the acceptable lumen per bulb output for non-holiday decorative lighting, creating a non-standard visual aesthetic that is inconsistent with community standards. I read it again, and a third time, Kelvin temperature. They had a regulation for the color temperature of my light bulbs. These weren't Christmas lights shaped like flamingos or a giant neon sign that said Leo's Party Palace. They were simple, vintage-style bulbs, the kind you see in every vaguely rustic-themed bistro in America. But here, in Harmony Meadows, they were apparently a beacon of garish nonconformity. The notice concluded with the penalty: a $50 fine, payable within 14 days. Failure to remit payment and cure the violation, I swear to God it said cure the violation, would result in the fine doubling every subsequent week. Below that was the signature, a sharp, angular scrawl that looked like a seismograph reading during an earthquake. Carol Peterson, HOA president. My first reaction was pure, unadulterated rage. I paced my living room, the letter clutched in my fist. I drafted at least 4 different scathing emails in my head, each more sarcastic and insulting than the last. I fantasized about marching over to Carol's house, a flawless beige clone of my own, but with an American flag flown at a geometrically perfect angle, and demanding to know what kind of person carries a light spectrometer on their morning walk. But then, a cold, hard reality set in. You can't fight an HOA. It's like wrestling with a gelatinous cube. There's nothing to punch. It's a faceless entity of rules and regulations, and Carol was merely its high priestess. Arguing would be pointless. They would just fine me more for my aggressive tone, or for the unapproved color of my angry face. Defeated, I slumped onto my couch. The giant 3-ring binder they'd given me at closing was sitting on the floor, currently serving the noble purpose of preventing my coffee table from wobbling. Harmony Meadows, Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. It was thick enough to stop a bullet. I'd never opened it. Why would I? I figured the rules were simple. Don't let your grass die. Don't paint your house purple. Don't sacrifice goats in the driveway. Apparently, I had underestimated the depths of their legislative madness. With a heavy sigh, I picked it up. Dust puffed off the vinyl cover. If I was going to be governed by these ridiculous rules, I might as well know what they were. I flipped it open, my finger tracing the table of contents. Section 1, Definitions. Section 2, Property Rights. Section 7, Use Restrictions. My eyes landed on 7.4, Exterior Lighting and Decorations. I read the entire section. It was a monument to specificity. It dictated the exact approved wattage for porch lights, the acceptable materials for light posts, brushed nickel or oil-rubbed bronze only, and a list of forbidden lighting styles that included, but was not limited to, flashing, blinking, chasing, strobing, neon, or any lighting that emulates a commercial establishment. It even had a subsection on holiday lighting, with approved installation dates, no earlier than the Friday after Thanksgiving, and mandatory removal dates, no later than January 15th. I kept reading, my anger slowly being replaced by something else. A strange, giddy sense of discovery. The rules were incredibly detailed about what was banned. They had thought of everything, from neon signs to black lights. But as I read, I realized something critical. The entire document was written from a defensive posture. It was a long list of thou shalt nots. It never said a single word about what thou shalt. It had no rules about lasers. It had no rules about professional-grade theatrical par cans. It had no rules about atmospheric haze machines, and it certainly had no rules whatsoever about synchronizing all of the above to a 120 decibel symphonic soundtrack. I closed the binder, a slow, wicked grin spreading across my face for the first time in days. They had fined me for my lighting's non-standard visual aesthetic. Fine, I'd give them a non-standard visual aesthetic. I would comply with their rules so hard it would break their tiny beige-colored world. They wanted me to cure the violation? Oh, I'd cure it. I was going to give Harmony Meadows a dose of culture it would never ever forget. Carol wanted a war over light. I was going to give her a goddamn sun et lumiere. The first step in any good revenge plot is logistics. My rage had cooled and hardened into a crystal-clear plan. I wasn't just going to strap a laser pointer to a sprinkler head and call it a day. This was going to be a production. It had to be technically flawless, artistically defensible, and most importantly, so meticulously compliant with the letter of the HOA law that their heads would spin. My decade spent wrangling lighting rigs for prima donna rock stars and perpetually stoned roadies had prepared me for this moment. I knew the tech, I knew the suppliers, but I also knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed a co-conspirator, a contractor who not only had the gear, but also the right kind of anarchic spirit. I needed someone who would hear my plan and not immediately call the police or a mental health professional. I spent an evening scouring the internet, bypassing the big, slick corporate AV companies with their sterile websites and stock photos of smiling people in headsets. I delved into the digital back alleys of Craigslist and obscure forums for stagehands. I was looking for a specific vibe. And then I found it. A website that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2003, built on a GeoCities template. It was glorious. At the top, in pixelated, flaming text, was the name Gus's Audio and Visual Mayhem. The site was a chaotic portfolio of Gus's work. There were pictures of him setting up a massive speaker array for a monster truck rally, adjusting spotlights for a local production of Cats. And the photo that sealed the deal, grinning maniacally while testing a pyrotechnics cannon for a death metal band called Corpse Grinder. This was my guy. I found a phone number at the bottom of the page and dialed. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Gus's Mayhem. Hi, I said, trying to sound like a normal, sane person. I have a residential lighting project. It's unique. There was a skeptical silence on the other end, filled with the sound of what might have been a wrench clattering to the floor. Define unique, Gus grunted. You want Christmas lights that look like the Vegas Strip? 'Cause I can do that, but the season's a ways off. I took a deep breath. Bigger, and not for Christmas. I want to piss off my homeowners association with a laser light show professionally synced to classical music. A long, profound pause hung in the air. I thought he might have hung up. Then, a low chuckle rumbled through the receiver, growing into a full-blown, wheezing laugh that sounded like an old engine turning over. Buddy, he finally gasped, I'll be there in an hour. This is the kind of job I live for. Just so you know, I have a spite installation fee. It's an extra 15% for the sheer joy of it." "You're hired," I said without hesitation. An hour later, a beat-up Ford Econoline van that looked like it had survived a war rumbled up to my curb. The side was emblazoned with the same Flaming Goose's audio and visual mayhem logo from the website. Gus himself emerged. He was everything I'd hoped for. A man in his late 40s with a magnificent graying ponytail, a faded Metallica t-shirt stretched over a respectable beer gut, and a pair of hands so calloused they looked like they could fix a tank engine with a firm stare. He gave my house a slow, appraising look. "So this is the battlefield," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Nice place, real orderly. I can see why you'd want to mess with it." I led him around to the back patio and laid out my vision. I showed him the violation notice, the HOA bylaws binder, and my preliminary sketches. I wasn't just a client, I was a fellow tech. We spoke the same language of DMX controllers, beam angles, and power draws. His initial amusement quickly turned into genuine professional interest. He wasn't just indulging a crazy person, he was collaborating with an artist. Okay, I see it," he said, rubbing his chin and pacing the lawn. He pointed up at the roof. "We can mount 2 Cavant lasers on the gables here, pointed down at the facade. They've got a tight beam, real crisp. A dozen LED par cans hidden in those azalea bushes for the color wash. And you're gonna need a hazer. A real professional one, not one of those dinky party foggers. You want the lasers to look like solid goddamn bars of light cutting through the night, right? You want to see the architecture." "Exactly," I said, my excitement growing. "But the music has to be classical, the height of culture. It makes it harder for them to complain. Nobody wants to be the person who files a noise complaint against Beethoven." Gus clapped me on the shoulder, his face split by a massive grin. "Oh, this is beautiful. This is poetry, weaponized Vivaldi. I love it." We spent the next hour in a flurry of creative energy. We planned the entire setup. The discreetly placed outdoor speakers, the waterproof cabling he'd have to run from my garage's sub-panel, the control board I could run from a laptop in my home office. He drew a surprisingly detailed schematic on the back of an old invoice. He gave me a quote that was, frankly, a steal. The 15% spite installation fee was clearly just a joke. He was giving me a massive discount because he believed in the cause. The next day, my credit card wept as I placed the orders and paid Gus's deposit. While the gear was in transit, I worked on the final, crucial piece of my preemptive strike. I sat down at my computer and composed a letter. It was polite, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. To the Harmony Meadows HOA Board, RE, violation. Notice hash 867, 5309. Dear members of the board, this letter is to confirm that, in accordance with the violation notice dated October 8th, I have removed the non-compliant Edison-style string lights from my rear patio. The violation has been cured. As per the community covenants, I will be installing a new exterior lighting display. I have conducted a thorough review of the Harmony Meadows covenants, conditions and restrictions, specifically Section 7.4, regarding exterior lighting and decorations. I can confirm that the new installation is fully compliant with all written regulations. The new display does not utilize flashing, blinking, chasing, or strobing lights outside of specific, brief artistic effects that do not constitute a continuous pattern. It does not employ any neon elements. All visible light sources are of an untinted white or primary color origin, and do not fall under the definition of non-standard color temperatures as they are generated by laser and LED sources, not incandescent bulbs. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I look forward to contributing to the unique and vibrant aesthetic of our community. Sincerely, Leo Maxwell, 124 Summer Oak Lane. I printed it on nice resume paper, signed it, and sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. I was building my fortress of plausible deniability. I wasn't breaking their rules. I was following them with a glorious, malicious precision they couldn't possibly anticipate. The orchestra was mobilized. The sheet music was written. All that was left was to wait for the curtain to rise. Installation day was a spectacle in itself. Gus and his one-man crew, a lanky, perpetually slouching teenager named Skeeter, who seemed to communicate exclusively through grunts and expert cable taping, arrived in their battle-scarred van just after 9 in the morning. The quiet suburban street, accustomed only to the gentle hum of electric leaf blowers and the occasional dog bark, was suddenly transformed into a rock concert load-in zone. Heavy-duty black cases were wheeled across my pristine lawn. Miles of thick rubber cable snaked from the van to the house. Gus, moving with the surprising agility of a man half his size, scaled a ladder to the roofline, a power drill hanging from his belt. Skeeter, meanwhile, was crawling through my azalea bushes, expertly camouflaging the par can lights among the foliage, securing them with zip ties and quiet teenage angst. The operation did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Henderson from next door peered through her blinds, her face a mask of worried curiosity. Mr. Gable from across the street, who was in the middle of his ritualistic Saturday car washing, paused with his chamois cloth in hand, staring openly as Gus mounted what looked like 2 high-tech cannons to my gables. "Morning, George," I called out cheerfully, giving him a wave. "Leo," he called back, gesturing with the wet cloth. "Getting some new security lights?" "Something like that," I yelled, the lie tasting sweet. "Just really getting into landscape lighting. You know, for ambiance." He nodded slowly, unconvinced, and returned to polishing his minivan with a renewed, troubled vigor. The most delicious moment came around noon. As if summoned by a disturbance in the beige force, Carol Peterson's daily patrol route brought her right past my house. She stopped dead in her tracks on the sidewalk. Her mouth fell slightly agape. She took in the scene: the van, the cables, the strange equipment now permanently affixed to my roof. Her eyes, magnified by her visor, darted around, trying to process the data. She looked at me, her expression a perfect cocktail of suspicion and confusion. I gave her my biggest, most innocent, "I'm a fully compliant homeowner" smile, and a cheerful little wave. The look of pure, impotent rage she shot back was more satisfying than any cup of coffee I'd ever had. She made a furious note on her clipboard and marched off, her power walk filled with righteous purpose. I knew I'd be hearing from her. I was counting on it. By late afternoon, the work was done. Everything was wired, tested, and connected to a DMX controller box in my office. Gus walked me through the software, a surprisingly intuitive program that let me design and trigger cues with the click of a mouse. "She's all yours, Maestro," Gus said, wiping grease from his hands onto his jeans. "The hazer's on a remote. Give it a 5-minute warm-up before the show, and wait for a calm night. You want that haze to hang in the air like a creepy fog." He packed up his tools, gave Skeeter a grunt of approval, and they rumbled off down the street, leaving my house looking exactly as it had before, but now armed to the teeth with light and sound. I waited until Tuesday. The forecast promised a clear sky and still air. As dusk settled over Harmony Meadows, bathing the world in a soft, HOA-approved gray, I felt a familiar buzz. It was the same electric, pre-show jitters I used to get right before a band hit the stage. My heart was pounding like a kick drum solo. This was it. This was the overture to the opera of my suburban discontent. From my office window, I had a perfect view of the front of my house and the street beyond. At 8:59 p.m., I switched on the hazer. A low hum filled the air as the machine began to generate a thin, almost invisible mist that drifted slowly across the lawn. At exactly 9 p.m., I clicked the Master Go button on my laptop. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the 4 outdoor speakers Gus had hidden in the garden beds, the first soft, tentative notes of Beethoven's Ode to Joy began to swell. It was quiet at first, tasteful. Then, as the melody began to build, I brought up the first lighting cue. A deep, rich royal blue from the par cans flooded the entire front of my house, washing the beige siding in an ethereal glow. The effect was immediate. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. A curtain twitched. Then, as the first crescendo of the symphony approached, I triggered the lasers. 2 perfectly straight, emerald green beams shot down from the roof, slicing through the thin haze and framing the front door like a celestial gateway. They were solid, vibrant, and utterly silent. They pulsed in perfect time with the music, growing in intensity as the choir kicked in. More lights came on in neighboring houses. Figures appeared on their lawns, silhouetted against their brightly lit doorways, their faces turned towards my house. Some were pointing. Some were holding up their phones. I was no longer an IT drone. I was a conductor, a designer, a maestro of light. I brought in more cues. White beams traced the architecture of the roofline. The blue wash softened to a gentle magenta. The lasers fanned out, creating shimmering, liquid patterns on the walls of the house, all dancing in a tightly choreographed ballet with Beethoven's masterpiece. It wasn't loud or obnoxious. It was genuinely, breathtakingly beautiful. It was art, malicious art, but art nonetheless. And then I saw her, Carol. Her front door flew open as if kicked. She stormed out onto her lawn, a vision in a pastel pink bathrobe. She stood there, illuminated in the celestial blue and green glow of my house, her face a perfect mask of slack-jawed, uncomprehending horror. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was seeing something so far outside her narrow, rule-based reality that her brain had simply short-circuited. It was the single most rewarding moment of my adult life. The show ran for its full, glorious 9-minute duration. As the final chord of Ode to Joy faded into silence, I executed a slow, elegant fade to black. The music stopped. The lights vanished. My house was once again just a normal beige house on a normal beige street. The only evidence of what had just happened was the thin, dissipating haze and the small crowd of neighbors standing on their lawns in stunned silence. 10 minutes later, the silence was broken by a new kind of light. Red and blue and flashing. Just as I'd predicted. 2 police officers stood on my doorstep. One was young, with a fresh crew cut and a name tag that read Miller. The other was a weary-looking veteran with a magnificent mustache and a tag that read Dave. He looked like he'd seen it all and was profoundly tired of seeing more of it. Behind them, on the public sidewalk, stood Carol. She had changed out of her bathrobe and into what I could only describe as tactical leisure wear. Her arms were crossed so tightly it was a miracle she wasn't cutting off her own circulation. Dave sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 ridiculous suburban disputes. "Evening, sir. We received He glanced at his notepad. "A complaint about a public disturbance?" "Disturbance, officer?" I asked, affecting my most polite and bewildered tone. "Not at all. I was just enjoying some classical music in my yard. Is that against the law now?" Officer Miller was visibly struggling not to smile. I could see his shoulders shaking slightly. "And the light show, sir?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Oh, that. It's my new landscape lighting," I said, gesturing proudly at my dark, inert house. "Is it not to your liking? I was very careful. I checked the HOA bylaws. It's fully compliant. No flashing lights, see? Nothing commercial." From the sidewalk, Carol's voice cut through the night, sharp and shrill. "It's a menace. It's light pollution. My begonias are confused. He's turning our neighborhood into a discotheque." Officer Dave held up a hand to quiet her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He turned back to me. "Sir, we also have a noise complaint." "Of course," I said. I used a decibel meter app on my phone to ensure the volume was kept under the 85 decibel limit for this time of night, as per City Ordinance 11.3. Would you like to see my readings? Dave just stared at me. His mustache seemed to droop a little. He knew he was beaten. There was no law against an overly elaborate artistic light installation. He had nothing to write a ticket for. "Just try to keep it down, sir," he said finally. The official-sounding words completely drained of any actual authority. "And maybe give the neighbors a little warning next time." He and Miller turned to leave. As they walked back to their patrol car, I overheard Miller say to his partner, just loud enough for me to hear, "You gotta admit, Dave, the timing on those lasers with the timpani was pretty sick." I closed the door, leaning against it with a deep, soul-cleansing sense of victory. I peeked through the blinds. Carol was still standing on the sidewalk, glaring at my house as if she could make it spontaneously combust through sheer force of will. The war had begun, and the first battle was decisively mine. The morning after the debut performance, an unnatural quiet hung over Summer Oak Lane. It was a tense, watchful quiet. As I took my trash can to the curb, I saw neighbors peeking through their windows. I received a few furtive smiles and one very enthusiastic thumbs up from Mr. Gable, who was pretending to inspect his perfectly healthy rose bushes. The battle lines were being drawn in the dewy morning grass. The official response from the HOA arrived the next afternoon, delivered not by a cheerful mail carrier, but by a grim-faced courier who required a signature. It was a thick envelope containing a multi-page letter from a law firm I'd seen on billboards. Donahue, Price and Associates. We take your disputes seriously. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It was filled with phrases like cease and desist, public nuisance, violation of the covenant of quiet enjoyment, and disrupting the aesthetic harmony of the community. It threatened injunctions, daily fines far exceeding the initial $50, and litigation that would force me to pay the HOA's legal fees. It was a sledgehammer designed to terrify me into immediate submission. I read it, put it down on my kitchen counter, and laughed. They were vague. All their threats were based on subjective interpretations of nuisance and harmony. They had nothing concrete, because I hadn't broken any concrete rules. I interpreted their cease and desist letter as a creative challenge. They wanted me to stop? Fine. I'd stop playing Beethoven. That night, the theme was drama. As the clock struck 9, the neighborhood was plunged into the thunderous, iconic opening of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. The show was an entirely new design. Aggressive blood-red washes pulsed across the house. Sharp white laser beams sliced through the air in angular, menacing patterns, mimicking the flight of the mythical warriors. It was less of a beautiful ballet and more of an aerial assault. For the grand crescendo, I even programmed a subtle but deeply unsettling slow strobe effect on the par cans, just towing the line of the no flashing rule. It wasn't a continuous pattern, it was an artistic choice. The reaction was even more immediate than the first night. Carol's porch light flicked on 30 seconds into the piece. I could practically feel her rage radiating across the street. My nightly performances became the talk of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood began to fracture. It was a suburban civil war fought with lawn signs and passive-aggressive greetings. Team Carol consisted of about 5 households, mostly older, retired residents who had nothing better to do than complain. They began documenting my shows with military precision, their cell phones held aloft like weapons, recording every last photon as evidence. I saw one of them, a woman named Doris, using a tripod. A tripod. But then there was Team Leo. To my surprise and delight, it was much larger than I'd anticipated. It was the younger families, the people who, like me, had bought into the promise of a quiet life, only to find it was a gilded cage of conformity. They were my silent majority. The rebellion was quiet but palpable. One morning I found a six-pack of a local craft IPA on my doorstep with a sticky note that read, "For the lighting guy. The 1812 overture was a stroke of genius. The strobes for the cannons? Chef's kiss." The night of the 1812 overture had been a particular triumph. I'd added a new piece of equipment to my arsenal, a high-output smoke machine that I'd hidden behind a large rhododendron. When the cannon fire section of Tchaikovsky's masterpiece began, I hit a custom macro. The white PR cans fired off in a series of blinding, instantaneous flashes, and the smoke machine belched a thick, dense cloud of fog that rolled across the lawn. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It was, I was later told by a gleeful neighbor, the reason Carol's prize-winning cat, Mr. Fluffington, refused to come out from under her bed for 2 days. My most vocal supporter was Brenda, a recently retired English teacher who lived 2 doors down. She spent most of her days tending to an immaculate garden that was a riot of color and life in the otherwise sterile landscape. Brenda had always been pleasant, but now she became an active co-conspirator. She'd stop by while I was getting the mail. "Good morning, Leo," she'd say in a stage whisper. "Just wanted to let you know, Carol is trying to organize a petition. Doris is her lieutenant. They're going door to door." "Thanks for the heads up, Brenda," I'd reply. "Any requests for tonight's show?" "Something with a bit of flair," she'd say, her eyes twinkling. "Perhaps a little Offenbach? The can-can might send Doris over the edge." The situation finally came to a head when the HOA called an emergency residents-only meeting. The agenda, printed on the same creamy paper as my first violation, had a single item: discussion and proposed sanctions regarding the Maxwell illumination problem at 124 Summer Oak Lane. They had named me. The gauntlet had been thrown. The community clubhouse was packed. I hadn't seen this many of my neighbors in one place since the mandatory fire safety seminar last spring. The room buzzed with nervous energy. I saw Team Carol huddled in a corner, whispering amongst themselves and shooting me dirty looks. Team Leo was more scattered, offering me subtle nods and encouraging smiles. I took a seat in the back, my thick binder of bylaws resting on my lap like a shield. Carol, standing at a lectern at the front of the room, called the meeting to order. She looked exhausted but resolute, like a general on the verge of a losing battle. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice tight. "As you know, our community has been subjected to a nightly disruption, a loud and garish display that shatters our peace and makes a mockery of the standards we all agreed to uphold." She went on for 10 minutes, her speech a litany of complaints: light trespass, noise pollution, plummeting property values, confused nocturnal animals. Doris stood up and gave a tearful testimony about how her sleep schedule was ruined. It was high drama. Finally, Carol turned her steely gaze on me. "Mr. Maxwell, do you have anything to say for yourself before the board votes on levying severe daily fines until this nuisance is removed?" This was my moment. I calmly stood up, binder in hand. "I do, actually. Thank you, Carol." I walked to the front of the room. I didn't stand at the lectern. I stood in the center, addressing everyone. "Folks," I began, my voice calm and reasonable, "I moved to Harmony Meadows for the same reason you all did. For peace, for quiet, for a nice, safe place to live." I paused, letting that sink in. A few weeks ago, I was fined $50. Not for a dead lawn, not for a loud party, but because the decorative light bulbs on my patio were, and I quote, inconsistent with community standards. They were the wrong shade of white. A murmur went through the room. I am a law-abiding resident, so I did what was asked. I cured the violation. I took down the offending bulbs. And then, I did something else. I read the rule book. I held up the massive binder. I read all 247 pages of it. I wanted to make absolutely sure that my next lighting display was 100% compliant with every single written rule in this document. And it is. I opened the binder. Covenant 7.4b forbids flashing lights. My lights do not flash. It forbids neon. I use no neon. It regulates incandescent bulb temperatures. My lights are laser and LED. They don't have a Kelvin temperature. I have broken no rules. I have simply followed the existing ones with a certain creative flair. I looked directly at Carol. Carol, members of the board, I'm a little confused. The letter I received threatened me with fines for creating a nuisance. But nuisance is a subjective term. My nuisance is another person's entertainment. I've had more neighbors thank me for the shows than complain. I gestured vaguely towards Brenda, who beamed. So, here's my proposal, I concluded, closing the binder with a firm clap. If the board feels the current rules regarding lighting are inadequate, then you should follow the proper procedure. Propose a new amendment. Draft specific language. Put it to a community vote, as laid out in Section 12.2 of the bylaws. If the community votes to ban laser light shows synced to classical music, I will be the first to comply. I will take it all down, but until then, you have no legal grounds to fine me for anything, because I haven't broken a single rule. The room was silent. I had them. I had trapped them in their own web of bureaucracy. They could fine me, sure, but I'd fight it. And with their own rule book as my primary defense, I'd probably win. The meeting devolved into chaos. People started arguing. Brenda stood up and gave an impassioned speech about the difference between community standards and oppressive conformity. Mr. Gable loudly declared the shows were the best thing to happen to the neighborhood in years. Carol banged her gavel, her face a thundercloud, but she had lost control. The escalation had reached its peak. Now, it was time for the grand finale. The emergency HOA meeting was a turning point. I had publicly called their bluff, and they knew it. Their power wasn't in the rules themselves, but in the assumption that no one would ever bother to read them that closely. The legal threat slowed to a trickle. I knew they were still talking to their lawyers, trying to find an angle, a loophole they could exploit. But it would take time. Time I could use to plan one final, spectacular show. I couldn't keep this up forever. My electricity bill was starting to look like a down payment on a small car. And frankly, programming a new, unique show every night was exhausting. The rebellion had been a success, but every rebellion needs a triumphant conclusion. It was time to go out with a bang that would be remembered in Harmony Meadows lore for generations. I decided to make it an event. I designed a simple but elegant flyer, far more tasteful than anything the HOA ever produced. It read, "You are cordially invited to the grand finale of the Summer Oak Lane Autumn Light and Sound Spectacle. This Saturday at 9 p.m. Bring a lawn chair. It promises to be memorable." I printed 100 copies, and in the dead of night put one in every neighbor's mailbox. The buzz was instantaneous. By Saturday evening, the atmosphere on my street felt less like a quiet suburban lane and more like the grounds of a music festival. People started arriving an hour early, setting up lawn chairs and unfolding blankets on their front lawns. Coolers were opened. Neighbors who had only ever exchanged curt nods were now laughing and sharing snacks. A group of teenagers sat on the curb, buzzing with anticipation. Someone had even brought a small charcoal grill. It was a full-blown block party, and my house was the main stage. My heart swelled. This was about more than just fighting with Carol. It was about this, about breaking the beige monotony and actually bringing a community together. Then, I saw it. A white van with a local news station logo on the side pulled up and parked at the end of the street. A reporter and a cameraman got out. Brenda, it turned out, had made a few calls. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a human interest story. The pressure was on. I retreated to my office, my mission control, and ran a final systems check. Tonight's playlist was my masterpiece. I was going to break my classical music-only rule for a finale that the occasion demanded. At exactly 9 p.m., a hush fell over the crowd. I took a deep breath and hit go. The show began quietly, with the soft, delicate piano notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune. A single, soft white beam of light materialized from the darkness, slowly tracing the roofline of the house, like a paintbrush made of moonlight. Gentle, silver-blue light slowly washed over the walls. It was serene, beautiful, a moment of deceptive calm. Then, the music shifted. The frantic, buzzing strings of Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee filled the air. The lighting exploded in a chaotic, mesmerizing frenzy. Dozens of thin, yellow and white laser beams darted and zipped across the house in impossibly fast patterns, a swarm of pure light. The crowd gasped. From there, it was a whirlwind tour of musical and visual intensity. Holst's Mars, the bringer of war, with deep, blood-red light and strobing lasers. A waltz from Strauss with the beams creating elegant, swirling ballroom patterns. I was pulling out every trick I knew, layering effects, creating moments of breathtaking beauty and shocking power. And then, for the final number, the music faded to silence. The lights went out, plunging the street into darkness. A single guitar note rang out, then another. The crowd recognized it instantly. A cheer went up. It was the opening to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. A single white spotlight hit the front door as Freddie Mercury's iconic vocals began. For the next 6 minutes, I threw every watt, every lumen, every particle of smoke I had at that house. The ballad section was a beautiful, multicolored wash. The guitar solo was a frantic, screaming barrage of laser strobes. For the opera section, I had the lights forming a hilarious, pulsing wall of faces. And for the final, head-banging rock section, it was pure, glorious mayhem. Every light I had was on, flashing and pulsing to the beat, the smoke machine working overtime, the entire house a blazing monument to rock and roll and righteous indignation. As the final piano notes faded, I cut everything. Blackout. Silence. For a second, the entire street was stunned. Then it erupted. Cheers, applause, car horns honking. It was an ovation. I had won. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The news story ran on the 11 o'clock broadcast. My little suburban dispute was framed as a hilarious story of one man's creative stand against a petty bureaucracy. The HOA's national management company saw it. The pressure from the top was immense. Within a week, Carol Peterson had quietly resigned as HOA president due to personal reasons. Brenda, to her own surprise, was nominated and elected as the new president, running on a platform of reasonableness and not measuring people's petunias. A month later, a letter arrived. It was from the new HOA board. In it, they officially rescinded all fines and dropped all legal threats. They had only one request, that I agree to dismantle the concert-grade installation in the spirit of neighborhood peace. It was a surrender document dressed up as a peace treaty. The following Saturday, Gus's van rumbled back down my street. We spent the afternoon taking down the gear, packing away the lasers and par cans. "You know," Gus said, coiling a cable, "for a corporate IT guy, you got a real rock and roll soul, man." "Just a deep appreciation for the rules, Gus," I said, handing him a beer from the cooler on the patio. "A deep appreciation for following them right off a cliff." He laughed and we clinked bottles. We sat there for a while, enjoying the silence. This time it was a real silence. A comfortable, peaceful silence. Above us, casting a gentle, warm white glow over the patio, was my string of Edison bulbs. Brenda's first act as president had been to lead a vote on a new amendment, officially approving them. Taped to my front door was a new certificate of compliance. I had made my point. The beige tyranny had been defeated by Beethoven, Queen, and a couple of well-aimed lasers. I took a sip of beer, the warm, gentle, perfectly non-standard light glowing peacefully around me. It was perfect,